So we've been talking about the scope of Revelation, right? With obviously with the context of disagreements around the date and the focus of the book, right? Early date versus late date, and then obviously Rome and Jerusalem. So the first week of class, just a kind of a refresher of where we've been up to this point. The first week of class, we talked about accurate Roman history, the Roman Empire's history primarily in the first century, and we extended beyond that into the next few centuries. Weeks 2 and 3, we looked at the date, and we showed that the evidence overwhelmingly points to a late date over an early date. And then the fourth and fifth week, we looked at the scope of the book. This is the discussion on Rome versus Jerusalem, to show that the book of Revelation does not support a Jerusalem-centric interpretation, and rather a Roman view is the more consistent framework for interpretation, obviously being at that late date. We looked at these things because they are widely misunderstood by some and used as foundations for the rather dangerous view of preterism, or sometimes known as the AD 70 doctrine. We then spent a few weeks digging further into the specifics of that view and some of the supporting ideas, right? So Stephen talked with us for 2 weeks about AD 70 specifically, its views, its teachings, and as well as some very useful fundamental questions that we can ask to help expose its flaws and see the problems with it. Following that, Stu talked with us in Matthew 24 and 25 to see what Jesus had to say about the destruction of Jerusalem in those chapters. We didn't talk much about Revelation in that class, right? But that's somewhat intentional because I think that shows us that Jesus' teachings on the subject were complete within that context. And the book of Revelation is not needed to shed any more light on the destruction of Jerusalem within its context, because that is not the scope of Revelation. Following that, Tim walked us through the preliminary foundations and understandings of the kingdom in relation to the church and its establishment in the book of Acts. And we did this because Scripture is clear that the kingdom was established and existing early during the time of the book of Acts, rather than being established in AD 70, which is taught by the preterist. I know the lessons that Stu and Tim taught, we all planned this together ahead of time. They might seem unrelated from the rest of the study, but they are crucial ideas to understanding the faults in the foundations of preterism that Stephen taught us about, and as well as some of the ideas that we'll talk about tonight. So with all of those topics covered, right, we've had 9 lessons so far. Largely, I'd consider this class complete. The topic sufficiently covered. However, I have been asked to speak on a different subject by request by a few different people. About a year ago, this book was given to me. It's a book by a man named Arthur Ogden, and the title is The Avenging of the Apostles and the Prophets. So this book was given to me by a few members of the church. They suggested that I consider the arguments within it and possibly rethink my position on Revelation. Those same individuals asked if I could provide my thoughts on the book, and so that is what I plan on doing tonight. This book fit naturally into the study and research that I had been doing for the past couple of years. As I mentioned the first week of this class, I set out to solidify my views on the historical context and scope of Revelation, long before anybody asked me in class my thoughts on the subject. I wanted to know if what I had believed and taught for over 10 years was correct in its foundations, or if I had been overlooking evidence for a completely different viewpoint. To do this, I examined all the evidence that I could find for just about any major view of Revelation that I could find on both the date and the scope. Things for my view, things against my current view. I studied a lot of theories and ideas that I could come across, so you can imagine my intrigue when this book was given to me with the suggestion that it might change my thinking on the book of Revelation. So I set out reading this book with exactly that in mind. And it's interesting, I'll tell you, Arthur Ogden, in the preface of his book, had this to say about what his book would be. He said, "To my knowledge, for the most part, the arguments advanced in this presentation are not found in any other printed work. This material is so different, it will require the total cleansing of the mind of all misconceptions of the apocalypse in order to accept it. This is the unique feature of the book. Enlightenment will be your reward." Luckily for me, that's exactly what I was seeking. Enlightenment, right? But if I'm being honest, when I began reading this book, enlightenment is not what I found. Instead, I found a narrative that forces conclusions that deviate significantly from the historical record, that deviate from contextual consistency that I saw in other works on the Book of Revelation, and a narrative that is even inconsistent within its own arguments. And we'll talk about that tonight. I will be honest with you up front before I say anything else about this. I did not finish the book. I did not feel like I needed to finish the book. What I did read contained so much error and inconsistency that I had no choice but to conclude that the rest of the book could not provide a sound understanding of the Book of Revelation. Now, some might say that's unfair, right? You didn't finish the book. You didn't give it a fair chance. Well, my answer to that is simple. Sorry you feel that way. I consider this the same as I would any other religious book out there, right? If I was to read the Catholic Catechism, right? Or, the Book of Mormon, right? Any of these other books, right? That as you start reading them, once you begin to understand the foundations of those books and see the flaws in them, the rest of the book that's built on those foundations really becomes somewhat unnecessary to finish. And I really saw this in the same way, because here's the truth. Like I said, I wanted this book to change my mind if I was wrong. I began taking very detailed notes on it when I started reading, and upon finishing the 25-page introduction in the book, I had produced over 75 pages of my own hand-typed notes detailing error and flaws in Ogden's argument. My 75 pages on his 25. That was enough for me to make my decision and to remove any confidence that I might have had in Ogden's ability to change my mind. So after the intro, I stopped taking that extensive notes. I did read more. I read more on after that. I read much of his appendix, where he describes much more of his foundations for his beliefs. But enlightenment is not what I found. That 75-page document, I will tell you, I have reduced it to, I think, the core problems. It was obviously somewhat repetitive, so I do have a shortened version of that I can share with anybody who's interested. The final draft is about 30 pages. As my thoughts and notes in detail about the introduction to his book, I can share that with anybody who's interested. But tonight I've reduced that down even further to what I think is really the main problems with this book, and why I would not suggest this book to anyone to receive enlightenment on the Book of Revelation. Now, I will say this too. I don't know Arthur Ogden personally. I don't know much about his teachings outside of this book or his beliefs on much else. All I know and all I am speaking to tonight is what he wrote in this book, specifically on this subject. Arthur Ogden died in 2000 or 2001, so he's been gone for a while. So obviously I've not had the opportunity to speak to him. I have no interest in speaking poorly of Arthur Ogden or himself as a person, because like I said, I don't know him. All I wish to speak about is this book, because that's what I've been asked to talk about. So with that, let's get into the book itself. Within the first 6 pages of the book, within his introduction, Ogden puts forth what his position on Revelation is, and he proposes many different positions that could be possible. And the two that he classifies himself primarily as are historical and preterist. Neither of these would necessarily make him wrong by stating these up front. However, as he defines the arguments within these stances, I think would cause some concern, especially the idea of preterism, because that carries theological implications, right, that we've talked about the last couple weeks, that conflict, I think, with sound interpretation of Scripture. So what Ogden means by this, right, the idea of being historical in nature, is that this book, Revelation, is very much contained to a historical event, right? It is in our past. It is not speaking to events that are taking place now in our day. And I largely agree with that. I don't believe this book is about the year 2025 or current events. I believe most of it is things that have happened in the past, although it would still be relevant. Which gets to the next point, that Ogden further clarifies his stance on being a historical position on Revelation with being a preterist. And he clears up what he believes preterism teaches and what of that doctrine he would align himself with. And he had this to say on the idea of preterism on page 6, that preterism would tell us that Revelation has little, if any, meaning for Christians today. The idea that the book of Revelation has no meaning for Christians today is not one that I would agree with at all. And interestingly, on the same page 6, Ogden even disagrees with his own stance by saying that the message is still as fresh and meaningful to us today. Ogden, you'll notice in his book, will bounce back and forth between these two ideas, that the book of Revelation has very little, if any, meaning to Christians today. But it's almost as if he realizes, well, that shouldn't be true for Christians, right? It's part of our Bible. It should be fresh and meaningful today. And so he poses that should be the case, that this book should be meaningful to us today. However, almost all of his arguments and his beliefs on the book of Revelation will completely undermine that idea. And in fact, we'll talk about it as we get further into the class, but his arguments are going to make this book not meaningful to Christians today, despite the statement made on page 6. Let's talk about Ogden's overall approach. And what I mean by this is both his approach to writing his book, as well as his approach to understanding the book of Revelation. Because what I noticed very quickly within his book in the first 25-page intro is that Ogden will make two mistakes repeatedly that we need to be on the lookout for, because they might go unnoticed if you're not paying careful attention. And those two things that Ogden will do is he will make false conclusions, and he will do that based on false assertions, right? And I'll explain what each of these things mean. But both of these two things, right, as I explain what they mean, get them in your mind and pay attention to looking for these things, either if you read the book, which I personally wouldn't recommend, but as we go through the rest of this class, be on the lookout for these two things, because he will do it repeatedly. But let's talk about what these mean real quick. I'll define them before we get into really his teachings on the subject. On the idea of false conclusions, a key example of this comes from page 8 of Ogden's book, where he will make a foundational statement that really will set the framework for the rest of the book. And he will say this. He says, obviously, if the early date can be established, it would be unreasonable to pass over the monumental events of AD 70. Ogden is presenting this as a self-evident conclusion, that if Revelation was written at the early date, then we have no choice but to conclude that the book must be talking about the events of AD 70, that is, the destruction of Jerusalem. But this is not true. This is an example, I have it highlighted in yellow here, an example of a false conclusion. Now this kind of assumption it's clever rhetoric, but it is intellectually dishonest. And it sets the stage for his later arguments that if you accept Jerusalem as obvious, right, then his later interpretations may be clear. But let's be clear here as to why this is a false conclusion. Even if the book of Revelation was written prior to the date AD 70, that alone is not enough to conclude that Jerusalem has to be the subject. That is a logical fallacy. You would still have to demonstrate that Revelation's message centers on Jerusalem and show why it is necessary in the biblical narrative. And Ogden does not do that. Early in his book, he presumes, once he has established the early date, which we'll talk about, then Jerusalem is the natural conclusion, and therefore all verses can be interpreted from the standpoint that they are on this subject. That is a false conclusion, and we'll talk more about that. But let's talk about false assertions. An assertion, right, is an initial statement, the initial idea that he uses to build his arguments and to draw conclusions on. And Ogden often makes bold assertions that he presents as fact, and he builds conclusions on them without realizing, at least I hope he doesn't realize, that his assertions are false. A great example of this can be found on page 10 of Ogden's book, where he provides some insight into Revelation chapter 13 and verse 8 and what this verse might be talking about. Revelation 13:8 says, "All who dwell on the earth will worship the sea beast, everyone whose name has not been written in the book of life." Right? We defined this in our Revelation class, and we talked about this chapter at length earlier in an earlier lesson in this class. That we're talking here in this context about the worldwide emperor worship of the emperor Domitian, right, and of the empire of Rome. Well, Ogden makes the argument here, because there was no worldwide emperor worship, this verse must be referring to events after the rest of Revelation. Do you see the problem here? His false assertion is that because there was no worldwide emperor worship, fill in the blank, right? He presents that as truth, right? That there was no worldwide emperor worship. Therefore, we must interpret verses on this premise or this assertion. And that assertion is false, right? We've talked about it in this class. I don't think I presented this list earlier in class, right? But here's from my research a non-exhaustive list of resources and things outside of the Bible that talk about worshiping of the emperor at the time of Domitian. Talks about how Domitian treated not just Christians, but the entire world if they were not worshiping him. Like I said, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a rather long list, right? And in fact, in his appendix, a couple hundred pages later in the book, Ogden will write on the subject of emperor worship and say, we know that there was no emperor worship happening worldwide because there's no evidence, right? Ogden's argument is simple on the point. He says the evidence is missing. The proof is missing, is what he says. I'll give him credit, right? Arthur Ogden wrote his book at a time when he didn't have the internet. So maybe he was unable to find these resources as easily at his time. But now we have the internet. You can go look at these. You can go read these if you choose to. Don't get bogged down in the weeds, though. But the idea of emperor worship is heavily established in the external evidence, in the historical record, which is why scholars and historians overwhelmingly recognize this as being true, that Domitian was a tyrant and treated the whole world poorly for if they did not view him as a god. This is well established in history. So for Arthur Ogden to make the statement, because there was no worldwide emperor worship, is not fair. And the reason that this is so dangerous is in the context of his introduction on page 10, he does not justify this. He does not explain it in any way. He simply provides it as fact and then builds conclusions on it. So if you take him at his word that this statement is true without doing your research to look into it, then a lot of his conclusions start to make sense. But you have to first realize the assertion he's building it on is false. That's why this book is so persuasive, I believe. Because Ogden is a good writer. He's a clever writer, and he writes these things in a way where your attention is not brought to the statement that is false, and you immediately start looking at his conclusions and whether they connect well. Again, I don't know Arthur Ogden. I am not claiming that he is trying to be deceptive. I will give him the benefit of the doubt that he's not. But the statement that there is no worldwide emperor worship at this time is not true and is not supported by the evidence. These are two common things that you will see in his writing that you should be on the lookout for. False conclusions and false assertions. And we're going to see those more specifically here as we start getting into really the root of his arguments. Any questions on those two ideas before we get to any more specifics?
So I understand what you're talking about for sure. You know, in that same section, he flips the script and says that the empire-wide persecution was Jewish persecution of Christians, right?
Right.
And that fact is ignored. Is that widely discussed in external evidence that there was a empire-wide persecution of Christians by Jews?
No. From what I can tell, I mean, what the evidence seems to show from my perspective, right, the Jews were definitely a problem, right? Dating as early as the 50s and the 60s, right? The Jews were a problem for Rome. That's ultimately why Jerusalem was destroyed, right? So it would be foolish to say that Rome was not targeting or persecuting the Jews in any way. But to shoehorn that into the Book of Revelation, right, is a different problem. And I do have that later in my notes. We'll talk about it. But Stephen points out there a prime example here where Ogden will make statements like this, where because there was no worldwide emperor worship, there's no worldwide persecution of any kind, we can conclude this. Later on the same page, right, he'll flip-flop, right? Now there is worldwide persecution. It's just different. It's just not the same thing, right? And I'll show some better examples of that kind of flip-flopping here in a minute. But again, that is something that we will see repeatedly through Ogden's writing is inconsistencies on how he uses certain pieces of evidence and how he uses certain even texts within Revelation.
That seemed like another false assertion he was making when I was reading it.
Yeah,
in there too.
I agree with that. So let's talk about Ogden's dating of the Book of Revelation, right? Because as he stated, right, if we can assume that the early date is true, right, once he has proven that, he believes Jerusalem is a natural conclusion, is the only conclusion that can be drawn. So with a strong statement like that, I would expect for him to have very strong, clear evidence for the early date of the book. And very similar to the way I approached my class weeks ago, Ogden appeals to two categories of evidence: internal evidence and external evidence, right? Things within the Book of Revelation, and then also secular resources, right, that might help support the idea. So regarding the internal evidence of the book, things that are found within the Book of Revelation, we have conveniently already discussed every single one of Ogden's points in this class. Despite his claim that his ideas are revolutionary and that are not found in any other writing, most of the arguments that he presents long predate his book, some by thousands of years. And in fact, by the time I opened page 1 of his book and started reading these things from Ogden, I had already read them in other places and written my own thoughts on the subject. So Ogden did not come up with these ideas as he would claim, but the things that he uses to support the early date argument are the 7 kings theory in Revelation chapter 17, right? The idea that tells us we are in the time of Nero. The advanced calculations of 666 and Gematria. The temple reference in chapter 11 telling us that the temple must still be standing. And then the equation between the Great Tribulation and Matthew 24, that phrasing within Matthew 24 and Revelation, right? These are the 4 pieces of internal evidence that Arthur Ogden presents. Like I said, we've already talked about these, so I'm not going to break them down again tonight. Go back to the first couple weeks if you want to hear my thoughts on those and why I believe those are weak. But that being said, Arthur Ogden's internal evidence is weak, unfounded, and unsupported, because these are the only 4 pieces of internal evidence that he has to offer prior to moving to his commentary, where he starts interpreting things as Jerusalem and showing things on that account. Simply on the dating, Ogden does not have any strong points on internal evidence. So let's look now at what you are not as familiar with from Ogden is his external evidence, and he'll write about this on page 16 of his book. Interestingly, Arthur Ogden gives one piece of external evidence to support his view. Arthur Ogden presents this piece of evidence. He says the Syriac version of the New Testament, which is the oldest direct version of the New Testament, dating all the way back to the 2nd century, places the revelation in the period of Nero 68 AD. If you're not familiar with it, the Syriac version is an early translation of the New Testament, right? The same way that we have English translations, right? The Bible was not written in English, but we have it translated into our English. This is the same thing, right? It was translated into a language called Syriac, which was a dialect of Aramaic. This piece of evidence could sound convincing, again, until you do your research. Ogden is correct that the Syriac materials go back to the 2nd century, but the Syriac tradition at the time did not include the Book of Revelation. if you went to your local bookstore in the 2nd century to buy the Syriac version of the Bible, Revelation would not be in it. Right? I'm being somewhat facetious. They didn't have bookstores the same way we'd think about it, right? But Revelation was not included until about 500 to 600 years later in the 6th and 7th century. That is when Revelation was finally translated into this language. So Ogden is not really being fair here by drawing on the date of the 2nd century for the Syriac version, when that version of the Syriac Bible did not include Revelation. The other issue here is that by the time Revelation was translated into the Syriac version, the Syriac translation did not date the book of Revelation, right? It was simply a translation. It was not a commentary on the book of Revelation or any other book of the Bible. It was a translation. So Ogden's claim that the Syriac version points to Nero of 68 AD is not entirely accurate, and he'll clear it up here in a few minutes, I will show, to be fair. Ogden is likely citing external materials to the Syriac version who may have been quoting that translation, that those writers believed that the book was 68 AD. So by extension, he is putting this claim on the Syriac version, but that's not really accurate. This does not support the early date in the way that Ogden claims. And like I said, to his credit, Ogden immediately concedes on this point. Right. The sentence that I have on the screen right now is on page 16. The very literal next sentence says this: while this evidence does not prove that John wrote the book in 68 AD, it does indicate that early church fathers accepted the early date. You see a problem here? Arthur Ogden presents one piece of evidence, immediately clarifies, well, this really doesn't make my point. This really doesn't prove what I'm proposing that it does, right? He gives one piece of evidence and then one sentence later discredits it himself. He is saying, this is why I concluded that earlier what he probably meant was resources were quoting the Syriac version. These early church fathers that he's referencing is probably what he meant. That's just not what he wrote in that first sentence. But early church fathers typically are not referring to writers in a foreign language in the 7th century, right? That's why I believe in that first sentence he's trying to connect it back to the 1st and 2nd century for the Syriac version, because it is writers much closer to the 1st and 2nd century who are much closer, at least in language, who are often considered to be early church fathers, although that's not a inspired idea, the idea of early church fathers. That's a secular idea that we have come up with much later. But it's this idea of people who were very close to the beginning of the church, very close to the start of the church, writing on spiritual subjects, seeing how they were using Scripture, how they were interpreting Scripture. So these writers who would have been quoting the 7th century Syriac, I don't think I would include as early church fathers personally. But if anything, it would put them at odds with who truly would be considered these early church fathers, like Irenaeus, Eusebius, and many of the others we've talked about in this class, who wrote in the 2nd century and beyond, who do put the book of Revelation in the Domitianic period, as we've seen. These writers would be fringe at best. But it's interesting that Ogden presents this as his first and only piece of external evidence, even though he concedes that it doesn't prove his point. But again, notice this. Again, this is a direct quote from his book. The very next sentence in Ogden's book says this: other evidences could be given to support the early date of the book, but these are sufficient. My jaw dropped when I read that. I was on the edge of my seat waiting for so much more, and he had nothing to give, right? I will give you one piece of evidence that I will admit doesn't really prove my point. I could give you more, but that's sufficient. And then he moves on. At this point in the book, Ogden transitions now to the conclusion that we know the book of Revelation is the early date, therefore we can now have our discussion on Jerusalem. That is unfair. That is not a fair way of viewing the evidence. And as far as convincing your audience, you have not provided sufficient evidence, at least in my mind, that the book of Revelation is the early date, right? I need more. and I didn't get it, right? Ogden then has in his appendix a full section called Dating of the Apocalypse, where all he does is continue furthering these exact same ideas. He does not provide any new ideas. So I was left really wanting more at the conclusion of his dating subject. That he failed to convince me and to convince me to leave the other evidence. But it's interesting, right, that the evidence, at least as far as external, but I believe internal as well, but if we're looking specifically at external evidence, it overwhelmingly supports the late date, right? That is what we have shown and talked about in this class. Arthur Ogden would agree with me on the point, interestingly enough. About 6 pages prior to this, Ogden said that the case for the date of the book would be settled quickly if it were based upon the number of scholars supporting a given date. That he conceded, even before he began talking about it, that the external evidence overwhelmingly supports the late date, right? Does this necessarily make him wrong? No. But it is a concession very early on that he is following a view of the book of Revelation that is not supported by the vast majority of the evidence. His stance is supported by very little evidence himself. It gives me very little confidence in his ability to date the book. Question.
Yeah, I had a question for you, Cody. When he says this statement on page 16 about Wallace evidence, when he says that the Syriac version, dating all the way back to the 2nd century, places the revelation in the period of Nero, 68 AD. Is that just a statement from a commentary that's making that claim, or where? I mean, I don't see where that claim is like on the translation. Things I've looked at say, well,
right.
Some have said
right.
that, but
That's why I said earlier, when he talks about, right, his concession in that second sentence, that this doesn't prove that John wrote the book, but it indicates that early church fathers accepted the date. I think he is drawing on some kind of commentary from the late first millennium, right, that is talking and using the Syriac version. I think that's what he's trying to quote. He does have a subscript pointing to, a man named Wallace. I don't know what Wallace writes on the subject. I didn't really care to look into that
I'm just
deeper.
curious. I couldn't find. I thought maybe there was like a subheader that was added there by the translators, but I can't find anything like that.
Cody the Stu.
Yes.
The quote at the very bottom of this slide. So
Right.
I don't know the context of what he's writing kind of around that section,
Right.
but it could be, the way I read that, if he really feels like there is the number of scholars supporting the early date outweighs the later date. Like you said before, he didn't have the internet. He may not have had all of the outside references. So I don't know that he's necessarily saying, it's the late date if you add up all the scholars. It's like he didn't know. He doesn't have enough information.
Right. So to that point, right, what Ogden is writing in that section of page 10, he starts that on page 9 and he gets to this quote on page 10. What he is saying is right before he begins going into the evidence for the early date, right? He has given evidence that he believes is there for the late date, which we're going to talk about here in a second. And he admits very early, before going into his discussion on the early date, right, that because I've just presented you the late date evidence, just know that's going to outweigh the evidence that I'm going to be able to give you on the early date. It's almost a preparing you for the surprise that's about to come, that he doesn't have much evidence. So he seems to be making the point that because there is not a lot of external evidence for the early date, that we should really dismiss the external evidence largely and look more at internal. Seems to be the point he's trying to make. Because his view is not supported by that date, right? The only way to support that view is to really lean more on the internal evidence rather than the external evidence. But like I said, we didn't talk about the internal evidence tonight because we talked about it earlier in the class. So everyone could go back to that if you're curious on that discussion. But Ogden is right? The evidence that can be found, right? In his research, I found the same thing. I concluded the same thing, right? So if we're strictly looking at external evidence, we would have to go with the late date.
Just real quickly, I did find that commentary by Wallace that's referenced on page 16, and it is Wallace's view that he's got a quote in there that there was some sort of a subscript for the title. It was a title given to the book of Revelation, attributing it to the time in which they said that John was banished to the island of Patmos during, it says, during the reign of Nero. And so it's like an explanation at the top of the book. I don't believe it's truly a translation of Revelation more so than it is a commentary at the top.
Right.
So anyway, I just thought I'd share that.
No, thank you for bringing that up, because I concluded that must have been the point that Ogden was trying to make, that there was some commentary on it. Again, a couple hundred years later, it would be evidence. Sure, I'll give you that, or I give him that, but it would contradict the vast majority of evidence at the time. And there are some other I think the reason that commentary, right, we're going to get to it in a minute. I think there's a reason that exists in the Syriac version that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But something else Ogden will do on the subject, right, as he proposes, he shows the evidence for the late date, because at this point he acknowledges there is more evidence for that date. But what he will do is he will present the evidence for the late date while discrediting it at the same time, which is a fair approach, right? I don't think that's necessarily a wrong approach. I would do the same thing, right? Seeing if there's any credible nature or reliability to those pieces of evidence. But I want to show you a few of those, because I want to show that I don't think Ogden is being fair with the evidence that he presents. And let's talk first about the statement by Irenaeus, right, that he believes we can dismiss entirely. This piece of evidence, I presented this weeks ago, right, so you should be familiar with it, but Irenaeus writes this in Against Heresies. He says, "For if it were necessary that his name," talking about the Antichrist, should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him, John, who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For it was seen not very long time since, but almost in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign." What Irenaeus is saying here is, it's just a further clarification of the first point. He mentioned John seeing the apocalyptic vision, and that the apocalyptic vision, was seen towards the end of Domitian's reign. I brought this up briefly when I presented this earlier in the class, but Arthur Ogden makes a point here that many people do, right, that there is ambiguity around the word "it." That it's not clear whether the word "it" is referring to the apocalypse or to John the Apostle, right? What Ogden believes this is saying is not "for it the apocalypse was seen." He believes this is saying "for he, John, was not seen since the end of Domitian's reign." He believes that this is saying that Polycarp, who is being spoken about in the context, last saw John towards the end of Domitian's reign. The problem is, grammatically and contextually, has been translated into English this way for a reason. Irenaeus is referring to "it," a noun, not a person. He is not saying he. The grammar does not support that. So you really have to change the wording and force a different grammatic structure on a lot of these words to make this about a person. I believe that is a hopefully unintentional misunderstanding of this writing. But even if you grant ambiguity to it, right, it would still make this evidence for us, right? But Ogden says we should throw this out completely. He believes this should be discarded as any evidence toward dating of the book because of this ambiguity. The overwhelming consensus among historians, Christian writers, Greek scholars that I can find all conclude that this is Irenaeus dating the book of Revelation and the Apocalypse, which is the book, to the end of Domitian's reign. Right? There is very little question about that in the academic community, which I'm not a Greek scholar, but I can at least look through the research. And this seems to be a very minority opinion, right? That this is a misunderstanding in this way. Again, I think you also have to consider the larger pool of evidence, right? That to say that Irenaeus is saying something different, okay, if you want to make that argument, that's one thing, but there are a lot of other sources that we've already talked about making the point of Domitian. So it would make Irenaeus a very fringe interpretation or idea. Again, I don't believe Ogden is treating Irenaeus' statement fairly. We're going to come back to Irenaeus' statement in a minute. I want to show you one more before I make the next point on it. I believe on page 12, Ogden is misrepresenting Eusebius. Now, this is something it kind of upset me about Ogden's book when I read it. Just if I'm being completely transparent on it. Ogden claims that we should completely throw out Eusebius's testimony on the dating of the book, and I'll tell you why. Eusebius writes, again, we've looked at this in class already, it is said that in the persecution under Domitian, the apostle and evangelist John, who was still alive, was condemned to dwell on the island of Patmos in consequence of his testimony to the divine word. And obviously we know from Revelation chapter 1, Patmos is where John wrote the book of Revelation. Eusebius is very clear on when he believes the book of Revelation was written, that it was written under the reign of Domitian. Something else that Eusebius writes earlier in his writing on a different subject that Ogden will point to is on the idea of who wrote the book of Revelation, right? When we say John wrote the book of Revelation, I believe that is the apostle John, but there is some ambiguity there. That is argued by some. And Eusebius writes on that subject, but I cannot readily admit that he was the apostle, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, by whom the Gospel of John and the Catholic epistle were written. For the evangelist nowhere gives his name or proclaims himself, either in the Gospel or epistle, right? Eusebius is fairly mentioning that from the book of Revelation, John does not identify himself as an apostle. Therefore, there is some ambiguity on whether this is the same John or a different John. Now, Eusebius does propose the evidence for maybe a different John, and he says that that evidence is somewhat convincing, but he's uncertain. He is not certain, but he will also write that that really doesn't change the message of the book of Revelation, which I agree with. But the reason I show you this is Ogden brings this up to say that if a man like Eusebius cannot be confident on who wrote the book of Revelation, then that should also throw into question his ability to date the book of Revelation, right? Even though Eusebius's testimony on the dating of the book of Revelation is clear with no ambiguity, Eusebius's ambiguity on the author should cause us to throw out his entire testimony. First point I'll make, that's not fair. Eusebius does not question when the date of the book of Revelation was written. Right? He does not question that. He provides it with very clear statements that really can't be questioned. There's no ambiguity. He does openly admit ambiguity on the author, but those are not related points. So to use one to throw out the other, I don't think is really fair. But the second point that I'll make on the subject, which I think is probably the most telling, is I will quote for you something straight out of Ogden's book that can be found on page 7. This was written by Arthur Ogden. It is impossible for us to present irrefutable evidence that the Apostle John wrote the book. But since the Apostle John is not identified in any of these works as author, we cannot be absolutely sure. Do you see the similarity there? Arthur Ogden makes the exact statement about the authorship of the book of Revelation that he claims is justification for throwing out Eusebius's entire basis of idea for the dating of the book of Revelation. Unfortunately, by his own logic, 12 pages into his book, Arthur Ogden has asked me to dismiss everything he says on the book of Revelation, and at least the dating of the book. I think Ogden is being very unfair, right? That's why I mentioned earlier when Stephen brought it up that Ogden will jump back and forth from different ideas and conclusions to best serve a single purpose of proving the early date and then also proving a connection to Jerusalem. And I just don't think he's being fair with the evidence, right? That if you're going to make this kind of accusation against a man like Eusebius, whether it's a fair accusation or not, you need to be careful about making the own type of statement yourself that you're then making that accusation against. This shows the inconsistency in Ogden's writing. This is 12 pages into the book. And this is not the first or the last time that Ogden will do this. This will happen multiple times in his writing, where you can see, if you start comparing his arguments and his thoughts from different places in his own book, Ogden is not being consistent in this writing, and I don't believe that is fair. Now, I'm not going to throw out Ogden's arguments based on this ambiguity, right? Like I said, I don't think that's fair, so I don't throw him out on that point, right? Examine the evidence he provides, right? We've already done that in class. One more specific point that I'll show regarding Ogden's approach here is this is a quote from Ogden, not from me, okay? Ogden is calling out what he believes is a stupid mistake, right? That is his words. As we look at the Greek words that are used in this context, there are two Greek words that we see throughout a lot of the evidence that talks about Domitian, right? The word Domitianu, which is the possessive form of Domitian's name, right? The idea of Domitian, right? During the time of Domitian, during the time Domitianu, right? That would be the Greek word that would be used there. And Domitianicus is the other one. That's an adjective form, right? Domitianic, right? Domitianic persecution, right? His persecution of other people, right? Would be how that word would be used. These are two Greek words that we see. So when Irenaeus said Domitian, when Eusebius said Domitian, they're using the word Domitianu in the Greek. Ogden claims, and he cites a man named Robert Young for this point, that all of us have made a stupid mistake by confusing Domitianu and Domitianicus with Domitian, right? We've all made, as Ogden says, a stupid mistake by seeing something that sounds like Domitian and equating it to Domitian because of that. That he says these words actually mean Nero. Domitianu and Domitianicus are actually forms of Nero's name, not Domitian's name. And to conclude otherwise is stupid, is what Ogden said. The problem here is this is deeply flawed. This is not the prevailing theory of anyone I can read who studies Greek in detail, because Ogden will admit he's not a Greek scholar. I am not a Greek scholar. There is no linguistic basis to equate either of these terms to Nero. They mean Domitian and Domitianic. There is no usage that I can find, or seemingly that others can find either, that link these words to Nero. When Irenaeus and Eusebius write Domitianu, they are speaking plainly for Domitian. And that is how these writings of Irenaeus and Eusebius are interpreted by almost every source I can find. I struggled to find sources that would interpret them as speaking about Nero outside of Ogden. So here is, I guess, one of those points where Ogden has written something that he believes is revolutionary. This understanding.
Support that with anything, Cody?
He says Robert Young in his book writes that this is true. Robert Young admittedly was not a Greek scholar either. So this is an unfounded claim that I will point this out as well. Ogden doesn't seem to believe as well. He points it out here so that we can point to a writing like Irenaeus's and say, well, this was actually telling us the apocalypse was written at Nero's time, right? He uses it in this context, but I'll say the rest of Ogden's writing, when he references Irenaeus earlier on the same page, in fact, and later in the chapter and later in the book, at almost every other source, when Ogden reads Domitian's name in all of these contexts, he interprets them as Domitian, not as Nero, even though Domitiano is used and even though he claims that is a stupid mistake to do that, right? So if we're going to be consistent, right, I would expect Ogden himself at every point that this happens, where Domitian's name is seen in an external reference, that he should be pointing out this is actually a reference to Nero, but he doesn't do that. Because I mentioned the statement with Irenaeus earlier. Ogden presents this statement, and Ogden says that he interprets this to mean that John was last seen by Polycarp at the end of Domitian's reign, right? That is what Ogden himself declares as his understanding of Irenaeus' statement. Well, Domitian in this context is the word Domitianu, which by, again, Ogden's claim, would have to be Nero, right? If we're going to be consistent, this can't be possible, okay, for this to be true in at least this context, the way Ogden understands it. I'll point that out real quickly. Why? The context is talking about Polycarp and Polycarp seeing John, right? If we follow Ogden's point of view, that Ogden is claiming that John was last seen by Polycarp at the end of Nero's reign. Irenaeus also writes at a different point in Against Heresies that Polycarp died in 155 AD at the age of 86. So somebody do math. When does that mean Polycarp was born?
He wouldn't have been alive.
Yeah. Polycarp would have been born in 69. Nero died in 68. That would mean that Ogden is claiming that this is telling us that the last time Polycarp saw John was a year before Polycarp was even born. It's not consistent. And that's why I think, right, to be fair to Ogden, that is, I think, why he does not interpret it this way anywhere else in the book, because that wouldn't make sense to understand this as talking about Nero, right? You introduce historical inaccuracies that are unavoidable. So to bring this point up, right, to bring this point up now, in the middle of contexts where you're not following your own advice, seems to me inconsistent, right? It seems like a very out of context argument to make one simple point on a very simple subject, and then you move on and you force yourself to not even use it in your own arguments within the book. This is not fair use of the evidence, right? It is inconsistent at the very least within its own arguments, right? Ogden will jump back and forth between that being Nero and Domitian. And so like I said, I would expect Ogden to have very clear evidence on the dating of the book, because the rest of his book is predicated on the idea of the early date. I don't believe Ogden provides sufficient evidence to support the early date, to then draw the conclusion that now we have no choice for the rest of the 400 something pages of this book to interpret it as talking about Jerusalem.
This whole section about what was published by Robert Young is almost a direct quote from what is published in Wallace's book. So that whole paragraph is in Wallace's book, and and the one who called it stupid, he says is Young, right?
Right.
So he's just pulling it out,
right. And so let me bring it up. I told you I'd bring it up, and I forgot to do it. This idea of this misunderstanding of Domitiano, right? Like you said, came from Robert Young's book. That's where Ogden got it from. Seemingly, Robert Young is maybe quoting it from somebody else even. I don't know where Robert Young got it from. But I think that as we start dating back to something like the Syriac version around 600-700, though that is around when this early date, this alternative date of the book of Revelation started coming about. That is when I believe this idea of forcing Nero into both the internal context of the book of Revelation in chapter 13 and beyond, as well as into these external evidences, I really think that's when it began, right? So I would not be surprised to see many commentaries who are trying to make that point start to make this shift of pushing this misinterpretation and I think inaccurate view of the Greek language on these words, because in 700 those people would have been looking at writings like Irenaeus or Eusebius or things like that. That's why when we talked about in our class about the external date for the external evidence for the book of Revelation, you don't see the early date being at all talked about until hundreds of years later, around the time that the Syriac version was translating the book of Revelation. Not that they did it first. I don't know who did it first, right? But at the time of Eusebius and Irenaeus and these people in 200, 300, 400, no one is writing about the Jews. No one is writing about Jerusalem. No one is claiming an early date, right? That didn't appear till much later. And I think it's the misunderstanding of the language. I hope misunderstanding, if not intentional misuse of language, by some of those people that I think has trickled down, and now Ogden is quoting those sources that date back. Because, I mentioned earlier, Ogden claims that much of his writings and his ideas are not seen in other writings elsewhere. They entirely are seen elsewhere, right? Most of the dating discussions, right, that I could find personally, right, as I started looking into the dating discussions when I started my research, they were all making the same points, and you could trace back quotes. I didn't do it in every instance, but right, you could trace back sources, a lot of times coming from a common source. So this is the danger of one, I guess, not doing your research on this subject, but also just false doctrine in general, right? When somebody makes a false claim about anything, you can see just this spider web of just resources using it and going out to the point that it becomes accepted by a lot of people, to the point that a book like this ends up in my hands in the year 2025 that is quoting all of these sources that, when you trace them back, are not accurate at their foundations. That's why I believe this book is dangerous, because it is not checking the sources that are being used and confirming if the arguments that are being used, right, these false assertions that are being presented, it's not checking whether those things are accurate, because in almost every case, they're not. So hopefully that long-winded answer answered your question. Was any more questions at this point? I'm gonna go through the next section fairly quickly. So like I said, Ogden is going to shift now, right? He's at the very end of his introduction, around page, right? You get after 16, 17 into 20, especially you get towards the end of the introduction. He's shifting his focus now, right? Because like he said, once the early date's established, which he believes he has sufficiently done, you can now conclude with no other alternative that we're going to be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and a Jewish focus on the book. Now, we have talked about this in this class, right, about the problems with equating the book of Revelation to Jerusalem, that are all problems that, if I could sit down across the table from Arthur Ogden today, would all be problems I would ask him to help me deal with. All of those things from lesson 2, 3, 4, 5 from this class. But I'll just briefly mention a couple of them here, at least so you can understand where Arthur Ogden's argument comes from. Ogden, on page 20 of his book, he points to this idea of the cry of the martyrs in Revelation chapter 6 that says, "How long until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" That idea of avenging our blood, right? You can see that's half of the title, at least part of the title of his book, where he's getting it from. That the book of Revelation, he's interpreting this as avenging the blood of all of those from the Old Testament who were killed, especially apostles and prophets, he says, who were killed on behalf of the will of God and their dealings with God. But the context here does not support that, right? This is not a retrospective glance back to ancient Israelite suffering in the context of Revelation chapter 6. It is an immediate cry within the context of the persecution at hand. Right? Throughout the book of Revelation, this focus, the focus is on the current struggle, right? Read the first 3 chapters and tell me that we're not talking about the current struggle of the Christians at hand at these 7 churches. You just can't do it. There's nothing in John's introduction to the book of Revelation, and then obviously Jesus' address to the churches, that would give us this kind of indication that the rest of the book should be scoped this way. This is stretching the narrative well beyond the natural scope. And Ogden continues that thought with the idea from Revelation chapter 18, verse 24, which tells us that Babylon is condemned for the blood of the prophets and saints and all who have been slain on the earth, right? That this verse is cluing us into now the second half of the theme of the book of Revelation. This is the second part of his title, right? Where you get this idea. The first one's talking about avenging the blood. The second verse here is talking about the blood of the prophets. Some translations might say apostles, and all who have been slain on the earth, right? That's where the title of his book comes from. That because we know the date is correct, verses like these can be interpreted to be talking about Old Testament saints and Old Testament prophets and the apostles themselves and the claims that they make. But I mean, this verse specifically refuses to be narrowed, right? That is a detail we talked about at length weeks ago that I think Ogden is overlooking, that the scope of the book of Revelation and this verse is much broader. It is talking about all of God's people who have been slain as a result of their testimony. From the martyrs that he mentioned in chapter 6, to the encouragement to the churches in chapters 2 and 3, to even looking past this point to chapters 18 and 19, to the fall of Babylon, the message of the book of Revelation is consistent. God is bringing judgment against all of the enemies who have attacked his people. There's a specific one in this context, obviously being Rome, but not just the prophets or apostles. It's anyone who has been killed for their testimony within this context, right? It is not a narrow drama about avenging apostles and avenging prophets, right? This is not a story between God and evil on behalf of the Old Testament prophets. The context of Revelation does not support that. It is a vision of God's judgment on every power that rises against people in any age, which is why I think Ogden now, because of the conclusion he drew earlier we talked about, he has forced a misplaced emphasis on the Jews that he will not let go for the rest of the book. He is narrowly hung up on an emphasis on the Jews. It causes him to force specific verses into Jewish context rather than allow them to define what the verses actually mean. But it's interesting. I obviously don't have time to talk about all of it. The second half of Ogden's book is a Revelation commentary where he will go through chapter by chapter, verse by verse. I would suggest to you, if you don't believe me, skim through that and you'll notice how frequently he jumps from the emphasis on the Jews, which verses can talk about the Jews, to, like he said earlier, that some verses, because there was no empire worship or because this doesn't fit with the Jewish context, it must be talking about something else, right? Specific verses pulled out of context when they don't support the Jewish theory, but any verse that can be connected to the Jews is connected to the Jews in Ogden's mind. And, you know, the narrative that this pushes, right? We talked about it. Stephen talked about it some when he talked about the 80-70 theory. This is preterism, right? That we're talking about here. This idea that God was coming to bring vengeance on Jerusalem because of their rejection of Christ, and that it is at that point that finally God's will has been fulfilled and that he has brought vengeance, that the Old Testament is brought to its conclusion and its fulfillment, right? And that all happened at the destruction of Jerusalem, right? That the church, the kingdom, all of the things that the New Testament and the Old Testament prophesy about were not fulfilled until Jerusalem's destruction, right? That is the conclusion that Ogden is bringing us to in the last 10 pages of his introduction. And that is a false conclusion based on all of the false assertions that we talked about. And it does not fit within the greater narrative of Scripture. And I'll get to that in a second. Ogden closes his introduction, right? And we'll close our class tonight really talking about Ogden's proposed theme of the book. And I think Ogden, funnily enough, correctly summarizes the theme of the book of Revelation. He says that the book of Revelation's theme is the victory of Christ and the church over Satan and his helpers, the victory of the saints over all foes, victory in Jesus, and that the heavens still reign. I think that's an excellent summary of the theme of the book of Revelation. Revelation claims Christ's reigning, the saints enduring, Satan and his forces being defeated in this matter, and how God will deal with them in the future. Heaven remaining in control no matter what happens. But Ogden narrows this theme when he starts narrowing the theme of the book of Revelation and the focus of the book of Revelation to the destruction of Jerusalem. It undermines this summary. If Revelation is about Christ's cosmic victory over the powers of evil, then reducing it to a localized political event flattens its meaning completely. Instead of heaven's triumph over all enemies, now and in the future at that time, Ogden recasts the book as a commentary on the downfall of a single city and why that happened. A conclusion with, as Ogden said earlier in his book, very little enduring relevance for Christians today. When you water it down to a message for Jerusalem, it has no more meaning for Christians now, many years later. It just does not carry the same type of weight, which is why Ogden shifts his theme on the very same page to saying that he believes the book of Revelation must be concluded to be speaking about the avenging of the apostles and the prophets. The reason that hopefully you might can hear my passion talking about this subject in this book, but the reason I do it is because I strongly disagree with that theme, avenging the apostles and the prophets. Not that God didn't avenge the apostles and the prophets, but it was not the destruction of Jerusalem that did that. Jesus had already vindicated the prophets. Every Old Testament prophet who was rejected by Israel was vindicated when Christ rose from the dead, when he was killed on the cross. His resurrection confirmed their message, marked the final separation between God and any unbelieving nation like Israel. That separation was not about avenging the prophets. It was about rejecting Christ and the warning not to do it. The last opportunity that Israel had to remain God's covenant people was gone at that point when Jesus died and was raised from the dead. The destruction of Jerusalem was the consequence of that rejection, not the proof of it. Revelation was not written to make that point when Jesus had already made it years, decades before that, right? That's what Stu talked about and what Jesus was talking about. He prophesied about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and why that would happen. Revelation is not needed to serve that purpose. Ogden reveals that along with this theme that he proposed, right, avenging the apostles and the prophets, that when John in verse 1 of the first chapter of Revelation says that these are things which must shortly come to pass, Ogden states that John is saying the fulfillment of the old law tied to Jerusalem's destruction is the thing that will come to pass now. This is preterism, and it is wrong. Hebrews teaches us that the old covenant was fulfilled and set aside at the cross. That's Hebrews chapter 8 and chapter 9 and chapter 10. Colossians chapter 2 verse 14 said that the written code was nailed to the cross. The tearing of the temple veil when Jesus died in Matthew 27 signaled the end of the old covenant system, not its destruction 40 years later. Tim spoke last week about the church being established on the day of Pentecost by the apostles right after Jesus left the earth. That is when the church and the kingdom were established. We have no indications telling us that the kingdom would come later. And Stephen talked about that in detail. And we saw it in Tim's message and even some in Stu's message, right, as we talk about what Jesus actually meant by the destruction of Jerusalem. When Revelation chapter 10 verse 7 speaks about the mystery of God being fulfilled in the book of Revelation, it refers to the completion of the purpose of this vision itself, not the end of the Mosaic age. Making Jerusalem the centerpiece of Revelation overloads it with a theological weight that the New Testament never grants to that event. And it is dangerous to do so and to trust sources that do that. Even if we assume the early date, even if we assumed a Jerusalem focus of the book, right, which I wouldn't do, the book of Revelation cannot be adding theological weight to the destruction of Jerusalem that the rest of the New Testament scripture does not allow. And having that be the start of the kingdom is something that would be prohibited by the rest of the teaching in scripture. It is clear through every other book in the New Testament, the kingdom had arrived. It was there. The destruction of Jerusalem was not needed to make that happen. And any teaching that teaches otherwise, I think, would be dangerous and would be misrepresenting the true gospel that Jesus was meaning to bring. Ogden, he's a good writer, right? I don't blame anyone for falling prey to the dangerous writing tactics. I can't say I understand even everything that Ogden proposes in his book, right? But you don't have to research these topics very long to start seeing that the foundations Ogden is building his arguments on are, at best, weak. But I don't believe there's any foundation to it. So as you get past page 25 and you leave his intro to the rest of the book, he has not done enough to build the arguments that will change the rest of the New Testament scripture to the ideas that preterism will teach. I believe that Arthur Ogden's book is full of inaccuracies, inconsistencies, and false doctrine. My recommendation, if you have a copy of this book, is to throw it away. Don't use it for any understanding of the book of Revelation or scripture, because Ogden got some very serious points on the gospel wrong. And he uses those things as foundations to help you understand the book of Revelation in a way I don't think is accurate. The entire 10 weeks of this class, I think, show in extreme detail that preterists, the ideas of preterists like Arthur Ogden, are seriously flawed. And all of us who are striving for truth and fellowship with God need to be able to identify it when it is presented to us, so that we can get rid of it and make sure that we are all standing on truth the way God intended and the way that God designed it. That is my brief review of Arthur Ogden's book. Like I said, I have a document in much more detail going through the introduction. If you want a copy of it, I will give it to you. It talks about a lot of what we talked about tonight and even more. But again, I will say this as well, to close tonight's class and the entire last 10 weeks of class. Don't take my word for it, right? I blindly took, whoever taught it to me, I blindly took their word for it and trusted it for like 10 years and taught this book many times before I went and actually checked for myself. Don't make that mistake. Go do the research yourself. You might come to a different conclusion from me, and that's okay. We can talk about it. But check your sources before you build your ideas on something. Check your sources. Do the research, as hard as it may be, because it is rewarding. And I think it will help you come to a greater understanding of the book of Revelation, as it has for me, as well as New Testament scripture as a whole, right? I mean, it has built my faith outside of the book of Revelation, even more so than just specific to this class, right? It's extremely helpful. So please do your own research before you trust sources like me or Arthur Ogden, and see what the evidence shows. Examine it for yourself and draw your own conclusions. And let me know if you disagree with me. Any thoughts or questions on either tonight's class or the entire, 10 weeks of material? All right. Well, thank you guys for joining and participating, and we'll close it here. See you guys later.